Hello and thank you. In comparison to some of the papers we've heard today, this is a shameless introduction to a new project and a plea for help and discussion. I'd like to say a little bit about the project and then discuss some of the issues that it's raised that were not things I had necessarily ever considered dealing with and that are continuing to engage me with this question of headstone to hard drive and the nature of spoliation. The project is called Birmingham East Mediterranean Archive. You can find the web address there. I encourage you to go and look at it. It came out of a long-running attempt by myself and a colleague at the University of Birmingham during my PhD to digitize the archive of a scholar of art history and Byzantine studies, David Talbot Rice. When he died in 1973, his art historical collection was left to the University of Edinburgh, where he had spent most of his career, and there was a museum constructed in his honour. However, the remains of his excavations in the Levant and in Turkey and Greece were given to the University of Birmingham because of its long-standing history in Byzantine studies. There they sat in a box until 2 years ago, when my colleague and I opened it and went, "What's this?" Inside it are around 1,500 photographs of excavations between the 1920s and the 1950s, David Talbot Rice's excavation notes, and letters and conference notes from most of his work in the East Mediterranean. We sought in vain to get money to digitize this, but the bottom has dropped out of the market in fairly small digitization projects, until eventually we decided to just do it ourselves. This has since snowballed into a project that has become about scholars' archives. The archives that get built up over the course of a lifetime of working on subjects very loosely interpreted as being about the East Mediterranean, and which usually are lost when scholars retire or move on to other projects. The uptake we've had from this has been enormous. Very many scholars have asked us to digitize their archives, and we had to very quickly come up with a plan, what was feasible, what was possible, what we were aiming to do. So I'll lay that out for you first, and then talk you through some of the issues that that's raised, and I have no doubt that you will come up with others. So what we decided to do was commit to digitizing the material ourselves and making it available in high-resolution format on a WordPress site which allowed us a free platform to discuss it and create a space where other people could discuss the material, and to make the images available on Flickr, since we figured we do not have the digital capabilities to create our own platform for large numbers of high-resolution images, and it seems more likely to survive if we use a well-known piece of open access software. What we do not do, and this is the most important problem that I would like to discuss today, is preserve, maintain, or sort physical archives. The agreement we have had to come up with scholars is that we will digitize the archive and own those digital images for the purely practical reason that someone needs to be able to deal with them in 30 or 40 years' time. And then we return the physical archive, and what happens to it after that is not our problem. This is not a lack of caring, but the fact that both of us are early career scholars doing this on an entirely freelance basis, and we do not have the attic space to collect the boxes and boxes and boxes of slides that scholars themselves are keen to have available and don't themselves know what to do with. So these are images from the David Talbot Rice archive. A piece of Roman sculpture that he found in the excavations of the Theodosian Forum, I'm sorry. Itself an example of spolia. It's probably an imperial Roman sculpture, perhaps one of the many that Constantine moved to the city when he was building it. Despite the fact that he is considered one of the fathers of Byzantine archaeology, I find it very curious that David Talbot Rice photographed this fragment of the grandeur of imperial Rome about 9 times from different angles, whereas in comparison, his photographs of actual Byzantine floor spaces and bits of visual art are usually only a single shot to record what it was, and then he moved on. The second is a spoliated column that he's also whited out, presumably for teaching purposes. And the third is an image of the excavations of the Theodosian Forum with the Hagia Sophia in the background. These also preserve important street scenes from Istanbul from the 1920s and a variety of other sequences. He also has images from around Greece and Turkey. The initial importance of these images for us as we opened the box was, of course, that of destruction and accessibility. all of the David Talbot Rice archive preserves images of things that are no longer accessible. By definition, archaeology is a destructive process. His are the only records of excavation sites now completely lost by the practice of discovering them. Many of the other images, like this from a church in Trebizond, were in this state in probably the early 1950s. The church at the time was derelict, we can see from the photographs, and already the images have been subject to what is probably specific destruction of the image faces, what looks more like casual vandalism, and simply the elements. We've not yet identified where this church is, but I would bet good money that it looks nothing like this on the inside anymore. So functionally, these are the only record of schemes of images from this church. Quite excitingly, in another scholar's archive that we're digitising right now, we've since been given 2 interns, which is moving the process along, and I encourage you to look at the site. We're uploading about 100 images a day. We have possibly found a church that resembles this one that has a label on the back. So already the process of bringing these things together in a digital forum is starting to answer those scholarly questions. But we also decided that beyond the preservation of a record of damaged and destroyed contexts, the thing that we wanted to preserve was the nature of the scholarly enterprise. We wanted a repository that was free of judgment. We don't edit these images. We don't deselect for fuzzy images, for broken glass slides. It all goes in there. And we wanted it to be a place where material was available for the sharing of ideas that are not necessarily ours. One of the reasons for making no judgments is that I have no idea what people might want to do with these images. I can see all sorts of exciting possibilities for the history of photography, for art historical enterprise, none of which I would even know where to start talking about. But there is also the component, which is something that I myself have worked on, of how scholars actually go about thinking, which is where the archive as digital component is, I think, so exciting. What we are hoping to do is give access to the equivalent of 5 boxes of material, which is what we've received from one scholar. This represents over 40 years of working in the Black Sea area. It contains letters to and from other scholars, conference programs with notes on it, images like these, that in some cases have no context and no meaning beyond the fact that they form part of that lifetime of work. And I think the digital is a particularly important space for preserving that context, almost the recreation of archaeology in the images of the destruction of archaeology. It has a circularity that I enjoy, and I'm looking forward to seeing what people do with it. But of course, the big issue that it has raised is the idea of materiality, originality, and purpose in preserving these digital images. What is the original? What are we trying to preserve? Is it, in this instance, a carefully planned photograph? David Talbot Rice considered himself to be an artistic photographer, and many of these works are, in my personal opinion, aesthetically beautiful. They were certainly intended to be so by him. They are part of the history of aesthetic photography. In other cases, is the original the wall painting? Is that what we care about? Is that why this photograph matters? In this image over on the right, which is one of my favourites, it strikes me that perhaps the most important thing preserved in that image, the original if there is one, is a moment of a man camping in a derelict church on the Black Sea at some point in the 1950s. You can see his bedroll, the sheet that he strung up for some privacy. What is the original there except that moment of human interaction with the ruins of a previous civilization? The images themselves, to complicate things, I should say, are not original. What we have in the box are Kodak printouts from 1974 that David Talbot Rice's widow made from his glass slides in order to send them to Birmingham. In some cases, however, they preserve the break marks of glass slides that were damaged in transit. So it's complicated in ways that I had never previously thought of, the idea of the materiality of photographs and the purpose in taking these images in the first place. As I said, David Talbot Rice in many cases was seeking to photograph things for aesthetic purposes, as well as to preserve them for his own publications. But there are also the images that he edited for teaching, and it would be exciting and I think a valuable resource for the future if these images could once again be used in that context. But this raises all sorts of questions about how we process, preserve, order, and present them. How do you make an image available without presupposing the uses people will put to it? What notes do you provide with it? How much context? Do you preserve the notes on the back of a photograph, even if you know them to be erroneous, for example? We are doing so. Our judgment thus far has been that if we're preserving the full archive context of a scholar, then that scholar's errors, their uncertainties, are equally valuable. But it's questions like that that I would really like to put out to the audience here. I think it's also an important question in terms of what the images were for, that in many cases they were not for public consumption. We are making available things that were never meant to be seen. Ultimately, a decision was made that they should be. That's why the archive was in this instance left to the University of Birmingham. But that was not their original purpose. This is a scanned image of the excavation notebook that David Talbot Rice kept in 1927 when he was excavating the Miraleion, a Byzantine church in modern Istanbul, the remains of which were entirely destroyed in 1987 when a mosque was constructed on top of it. In many cases, these pages have been crossed out, where David Talbot Rice has clearly processed the information, turned it into his publication on the Miraleion, and then moved on. These are things that were intended to be swallowed into the scholarly process, and then presented in digested form as the thing which would in turn construct forever our vision of the lost Miraleion. I would hope that archives like this have the possibility to deconstruct that process, to make more transparent the scholarly interaction with our material, and the ways in which assumptions and practices have shaped the results that we take for granted. As we move forward with the project, the other exciting development that we've noticed is scholars showing an interest in creating this as a living archive. And this is something that I am concerned as we go forward to get right, to have the flexibility to evolve with, but we don't really know how yet. What's happening is that scholars are going to sites, visiting archaeological remains, taking photographs in digital form and then sending them to us to upload. Before they have processed them, before they work with them, they are immediately making them digitally available, partly because it saves them the effort of having to store them, but also because I think we're evolving a new way of dealing with images that is less proprietorial, perhaps, less based on the idea that what gives the scholar authority is access to a site than the interpretive framework behind it. This is becoming especially relevant politically, however, as a lot of the images come from areas that were available until perhaps 2 years ago, but are not now. Huge numbers of images from Syria, from Iran, from Iraq, that grow more important day by day, but also more politically contentious. We've had to make decisions on the fly that have been part of an ongoing question about how imagery interacts with the way in which we use the past, such as making all of these images available under Creative Commons license for free use, but without derivation. That was not something we initially wanted to do. People should be entitled to use images as they like, so we thought, and then suddenly realized that we were potentially uploading large numbers of images of some of the most contentious sites anywhere in the world, and laying ourselves open for all sorts of legal and ethical difficulties if these were reused in ways that did not represent the ways in which we, the Western world, seek to interact with images. Once again, the question comes up of how that judgment is made, by whom, for what purpose. What excited me particularly about this conference, apart from the opportunity to ask all of you for possible answers to some of these questions, for responses to these difficulties, is having to confront for the first time as a historian, and I'm sure many of you will think that I should have been doing this for years, but this is not the background I came to. I came to this subject from, of the issue of spoliation within spoliation. What is the difference between an image that we make digitally available when the original is available somewhere else? In the case of the David Talbot Rice archive, someone can look at that photograph, decide that they are unhappy with the digitization as it stands, make an appointment and go and see it in situ. In many of the cases that we're digitizing, that will not be the case. In some cases, these images have never existed in physical form. They've never been printed out by their producers. They perhaps never will be. In other cases, the images are lost almost as soon as we've digitized them. And second to that, and I think it is a completely different issue, and one that, again, we don't know how to deal with, what is the difference when the physical site of an image exists and no longer exists? What are the possibilities and difficulties in comparing a physically extant site with a collection of images, perhaps over time. As I said, we have at least one site now where we have images of it at least 30 years apart that can be compared and contrasted, in comparison to the only images of a site that is now lost. This is more a paper of questions than answers. We really don't have any. But what we're trying to do is interact with the pragmatic interface between questions of originality, of ownership and management and access, and the theoretical question of what the image means, how it can become a tool for discussion, for the development of ideas, and hopefully for a managed space in which to discuss the East Mediterranean in constructive and ongoing ways. And I think I'm going to stop there and actually turn it over to you, because I could keep talking about what's in the images and what we're trying to do with them, but I don't actually think that that would be addressing the bigger themes of this conference. Take questions at the end, or take questions now?
In a way, it'd be nice
yeah.
to talk through all three.
Yes, absolutely. But that's all I have to say, and I look forward to any comments. Thank you.
The final paper in this panel is about the title of the paper is Geometric Ornament and Recognition,